Okay, what we have here on the front part these are the big ideas and things that you need to be able to consider after the section. Any one of these could be a question that shows up on your exam. So it could be something that we'll review at the end here, or you review for a short period of time with partners or in a small group. For example, here, the war was part of an ongoing battle between France and Britain, so there's a lot of history between these two countries in particular, and we know that because these are the two founding societies of our country, Canada, right? But the battle in this particular case that we're talking about is the battle for North America. There are some specific catalysts or triggers that aggravated the tensions that led to war, including they both claimed land in an area called the Ohio River Valley. There was the new development of the British taking over control north of New France in that Hudson's Bay territory. And then there's the conversation about Acadia, and we'll talk about that. In the end, if you look, you can go forward in your handout there to page 3. At the bottom of page 3 is the image of what French and British and Spanish control of North America looked like. And you can see that the blue part there is the French. So they had a significant amount of territory that they had claimed power to. The pink part here on the right-hand side is the 13 colonies. Girls, I need you either to stop talking or go have your conversation somewhere else, okay?
You guys got in trouble in the recording.
Grade 12, I'm just gonna make your own choices, okay? But the difference from there to the one that follows, there you can see the results of this war, right? New France had, well, still had some of this land here, but you can see in the middle here, I'll pick a different color pen. This in particular was one of the main parts of this conflict. It was disputed territory. They both the British and the French said that that territory was theirs. And the reason why a big part of that was important is because these British colonists wanted to expand westward. And that dispute blocked them from that, right? And there's some other maps here we'll look at down the road, but that's the result of this battle in the end. A lot of pink for the British, right? And the French essentially gave up any control that they had in North America. The green part here, they ended up giving to Spain because Spain was their ally and they lost in that war. So as a way to repay that they specifically lost Spanish Florida, it was called. So they gave this territory to Spain. The only thing that they were able to maintain were 2 small islands in the Maritimes there, just because they needed some access for fishing and trade routes. But going back to the big ideas here. So that Acadia thing was a big deal there. It is the difference between their territory before and after the war, right? And so as an exam question, I might ask you to describe that. Right? All of this was about imperial power. They both wanted to prove that they had the most territory, that they were the strongest naval power, superior powers. They had a lot of different conflicts, obviously, over time with each other, but they had different priorities, and that's another reason why it ended the way it did. British priorities were about gaining that territory in North America. The goal was North America for the British. But for France, their goal or their priority was in Europe and the West Indies. So in the end, they failed to give a lot of money or send a lot of troops over to North America, which led to them losing it. But in the end, the reason that the British were able to win that is because they spent so much money to invest in that war, but then it ended up becoming a loss for them anyway because they tried taxing the Americans, what became the Americans, and they resented that and revolted. There are a couple specific turning points in this war. One of them is the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and we've talked about that before. Does anybody remember what that was about or what area it was related to? The Battle of the Plains of Abraham?
In the Plains of Abraham.
in the plains of Abraham. Thanks, Jackson Booth, for the correction.
No, that wasn't a correction. I said any idea where it happened.
No, sorry. Oh, okay, I see what you mean. I'm asking, like, what Canadian territory that we know of today was taken over by which group? Not Abraham. We're talking about Quebec City.
Alaska.
Quebec City, okay? We'll have to talk about the Acadians because there's a lot of controversy over what happened with the Acadians. And when we talk about that, we're talking about the area of Nova Scotia. And we obviously have talked a lot about New France. Acadia or Nova Scotia was not part of that. It was a separate French colony. So it was vulnerable to the British also taking that over, and that ended up happening. But the treatment of the French people that had been living there is also part of this story. In the end, the outcome or the consequence includes a couple of different acts that you'll have to know. The main one is the Treaty of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War. And there's actually a number of different treaties of Paris over time, just because that's the location of where they signed their agreement that ended the war. We know about the Royal Proclamation Act that established territory for Canada. American Revolution eventually came. The Quebec Act is significant, really significant, because we still have tensions related to Quebec today. They act and have different expectations for their province within Canada, and obviously that comes out in politics today, right? Elections, economy, things like that. The European method of fighting was different than the Aboriginal method, and so the groups that they were both allied with contributed to who won and who lost that war. You'd have to be able to look at the resulting map or territory of North America and who owned what territory. You should be able to make a comment about the results of that and how it has affected French Canadians still today, or what impact it's had on Canada's national identity, that we're a bilingual, multi-cultural Canada. There was an effect or an influence on Aboriginal communities and how they eventually grouped together. Just the idea that we have two founding nations, it really all comes from this war, which is the 7 Years' War. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. And like I said, you had a number of classes to review and study this yourself, so hopefully a lot of this is just going to fill in the blanks. So we know, and you know from other classes that you have, France and Britain were two major rivals, a lot of history between the two. This particular war, when we talk about the 7 Years' War, it wasn't just a North American war. We're focusing on the North American part. But it was a war from the Caribbean, so down in here, in South Asia, in West Africa, also in Europe. It doesn't mention Europe, but it's also up in there. What territory here is in blue is the territory that was controlled by Britain, so you can see those 13 colonies on the East Coast. Up here in the blue at the top is that Hudson's Bay area, where they were informed by Radisson and Grolier of the great furs up there, so that's why they joined and started moving into the territory up there. They've got the 13 colonies here, which eventually became the beginning of America. So their tensions and conflict existed across several different continents, which makes it a world war. Some people consider this the first of the world wars, and that is written on here somewhere. But specifically, we're going to focus on this period of conflict here, these 7 years. And you can actually, some people discuss it and they talk about 9 years because there were 2 years prior to declaration of war. To the British declaration of war. So when you talk about the history of the 7 Years' War, we talk about the things that added to or escalated that tension, which included a number of different parts. So when you study it or review it, just if you are ever confused by that, sometimes they talk about a 9-year period, but that's because there were 2 years of aggression, but without a declaration. And another thing that's important, and I might ask you this on an exam question, I might ask you, why is it also called the French Indian Wars when it was actually fought between the French and the British? They were the competitors. Some people avoid calling it the French Indian Wars because it gives the impression that the French were the only ones allied with First Nations groups, and we know that's not the case, right? We knew that, if you recall, the area that was south of the Great Lakes was territory that was used by those 5 Iroquois bands that made up the Iroquois Confederation. So we know that those groups were allied with the British. And then we had the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat clan, the Mohawk and the Micmac were part of the French alliance with the fur trade there. So the point here is that there are French Indian allies and there are also British Indian allies, and they were allied with different groups. So it says here, the French were allied with the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the Micmac. British in particular were allied against Iroquois. And part of the reason why some of these First Nations groups allied with the European group that they did is because they were kind of ancestral enemies to each other, right? The Haudenosaunee were in direct competition with the Iroquois for territory that they had access to and things like that. So that played a part in which European power a First Nations group would decide to align with, right? And we've used this term before, homogeneous. So we just need to point out that these, when we talk about Aboriginal groups or allies in that war, they weren't all the same. They weren't one large group that had a shared interest. They were the same as different cultures or backgrounds of people, right? So homogeneous means same, or like that sameness. They were diverse groups or tribes. And so their needs and interests were diverse. Okay, so we just want to point that out as well. So an ongoing battle escalating across several different continents. We're particularly focusing on the North American part of that. Happened over a period of 9 years, but essentially really the focused battle was in 7 years. So there's some examples here that talk about the tension that was happening prior to the start of war, or prior to this 7 years war. So some examples of the tension between the two groups. There was one called the War of Spanish Succession, so early 1700s. It was conflict between France and Britain again, and in the end result of that is that's where France lost Acadia. And when we talk about Acadia, we're talking about Nova Scotia. They lost it to the British control, but like we said, Acadia was a French colony, separate from New France. And even though the British won control over that territory, they didn't evict those French colonists, they let them stay there. They were able to trade with them. They allowed them to continue, developing the colony. All they really wanted was the territory expansion, so the claim to a larger territory. They wanted control over certain forts, especially in this seaport access, and fisheries. There was a lot of focus on the cod that they could get. And what did we say about, can anybody repeat to me that theory of mercantilism? What were they using this land and resources for? What's that?
Build more economy.
Build their own economy back in France, in their own home country, right? There were 2 parts to that. Does anybody remember the 2 parts?
It sucks. People in the colonies get mad because they're worth nothing.
The people in the colonies got mad because they were worth nothing? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yes, it ended up causing tensions for some groups. Other groups felt satisfied because they were being provided, provisions. The deal with that mercantilism was that there, and you could write this in here just as a reminder here, that there were So that it was still important. They let the French people stay there, but they wanted access to that territory there. So the loss there is called the Treaty of Utrecht. So that was what was signed to give up Acadia and Newfoundland to the British control. And with that, they also had to recognize, they were forced to recognize that the British had their claim to that Hudson's Bay territory north of New France, and also recognize Iroquois land claims around the Great Lakes. Okay. Another part of the ongoing tension between these two countries was the War of Austrian Succession. And in particular, it was about their naval capabilities. So battle in the oceans between the two continents there. And what the British ended up doing is their goal was to block the French ships from delivering those consumer goods or the raw resources back to France so that they could damage their trade, because trade was a big part of all the work that was being happening in New France. And in particular, this is an important location to recognize here. They were able to get Louisbourg, which is this part here, just on the entryway to the St. Lawrence.
I'm sure my auntie lives.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Interesting. So like when we've looked at, say for example, the election here recently, and we focused on the fact that, you know, really the election is decided in that eastern area because the majority of Canadians live there. That's the reason why, right? It was the initial settlement. Because the St. Lawrence Seaway allowed that access there, it's very heavily populated. Today still, but that also tells you how valuable that territory was to get into the interior, right? And so if the French lost control over this access to the interior, that would be a considerable military loss, right? Yep.
At Louisbourg, they still have the military base.
Yeah.
We went there to explore. They made it into a museum where
Yeah.
they have people dressed up and they act like they're actually living there.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's different groups that actually reenact those battles and stuff like that here. This particular one had like no other big particular gains because the French had already taken that Acadia, except that this is the point here where it's called the expulsion of the Acadians. And what they did is they said that for the French colonists that were living there, if you weren't going to support France, if you weren't going to support Britain, if you weren't going to fight against the French, then you needed to leave. And so there were 6,000 people that were removed from the homes that they had established, and they were shipped they either went back to France, and I think that's written here later, but they either went back to France, back to the homeland here, or they went to Louisiana. So if you know about the Cajun in the south, in New Orleans, that's where the French part came from, in the Cajun south. We talked about, or I think you looked into a little bit with your own research, that the British had their own allies, the same with the French. So here's the groups that they were allied with. And in particular, these two groups are the ones that were embattled with each other. Prussia eventually becomes Germany. And so in Europe, these are the European conflicts that were ongoing. Remember, we said it was a war on several continents? So Prussia and Austria were embattled against each other, which meant that their allies were also brought into that. The British were supporting Prussia and the French were supporting Austria. And the point here with the French is that they were only supporting it financially. They didn't send like troops to Austria to help them or anything, which is a part of where France's money and their focus was, right? The French lost North America in part because they had set their priorities someplace else, and part of it here was in Europe. The other part of the British assisting with Prussia or future Germany, they had an ulterior motive in that battle, seeming as an ally for Prussia, but their other gain was that they wanted to weaken the French, in particular the French Navy. Because if they could weaken the Navy, then that meant that they could crumble or weaken their trade to their North American colony crumble or weaken their settlements or the trade to them. So a lot of times when countries lose wars, it's because they fight them on multiple fronts and they just can't support that. And this is another example of that. And so here's a difference of priorities, and you could write this down if you're not writing a lot of other stuff here, because it's significant here. It's a difference of their priorities. And it may have really influenced the outcome. Right? And the outcome being that France loses North America. And we could just put this here in really basic terms. France loses North America, any of it. Britain gains it, or gains significant territory. Which might be a good thing, but their method of gaining it costs them, which ends up costing them that territory. The British won that war because they were able to invest a lot of money, but it was the investment of that money that ends up being the cause for them losing the territory itself down the road. And so that's established in the difference of priorities that they had in going towards it. So these are the groups that were involved, and they're in boxes so you can see who they were allied with and what territory they were occupying. And it goes along here with this map. So you've got the British that were allied with the Iroquois. There were other groups that were involved with them, but a main ally was the Iroquois, or the Iroquois Confederacy, which included 5 different groups. So if you're not very familiar with this, and I know some of you are, the big part here is these 13 colonies on the side. All of this here, they're called the 13 colonies. They were the first settlements for the British there on the eastern coast. They're still really heavily populated areas of America. New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, North and South Carolina. It goes way up. You know, if you think about like Chicago is somewhere down over here, Ottawa is way down here. You've got parts of America that are much more north than parts of what ends up being Canada. Here's your Louisbourg, Nova Scotia, that was French. You've got some British control of territory in the mouth there of the St. Lawrence area. Okay. The French wanted to keep their blue territory. They were allied with those Haudenosaunee and the Wendat. They had control over the St. Lawrence region that got them into the interior. It got them to those furs, right? They're also up at a little bit north. They were in northern Canada as well to get those thick furs. And the French were allied here with the Spanish, mostly just financially, that the Spanish supported them. There's a handout you can grab. Yeah. And the Spanish had territory. They had what was called Spanish Florida that was lost in this battle. Territory in Mexico, Cuba, South America. So the Spanish were heavily in control of a lot of territory as well. But if you're going to write on your handout there, one of the major conflicts, one of the most important parts of this conflict is this territory that's right in here. It was a main point of conflict in North America. Because, anybody? Why? You've got British colonists in this pink area or coral area here. You've got French people all around them, surrounding them and blocking them off towards the west of that eastern coast. What was the main point of conflict there?
River Valley.
The river valley, because?
Because they wanted it for transportation.
Not necessarily transportation, but they wanted to expand. Yeah. Main point of conflict in North America because both the French and British claimed it for expansion. Because if you can think that it's along that Appalachian mountain range, if that was blocked off and those British colonists on the east coast weren't allowed to move anywhere west, they'd have nowhere really to go. It was a major point of contention for those British colonists. And that's one of the escalating parts or one of the triggers of the actual war itself, right? So two big concerns that they had, they wanted to expand into that territory. And the second part was they also wanted area for trade, right? The more settlements they had in that new territory meant the more consumers for merchandise that came from the main countries, meant more natural resources that they could send back. So that territory is called the Ohio River Valley, and it's really important that you'll know that. And it's this part on your handout. I'm not sure how well you can see it in your black and white color, but it's got the lines through it. It's that disputed territory. You could draw an arrow to it. It's this Ohio River Valley. Both countries wanted it, despite the large amounts of space that they already had claim and acknowledged ownership of. That was a territory that it was all coming to a head right there. And because they both claimed it, they both started building forts because they thought, well, if we're populating the area, if we're settling in the area, it gives us more claim to it. So that's where a lot of the initial battles, if we said that there were 2 years of aggression before the actual war, they happened here in that territory. But here's an actual important point. We haven't really talked much about the Bahamas and the Caribbean down here, but these were the sugar colonies, they called them. And of any territory or colony that another country owned, these were the most valuable because they had the more valuable commodity. So all of this other land in North America wasn't worth as much to them as these smaller locations in the Caribbean because of what they could provide for citizens back in the UK and France, right? So all of this competition was over North America, but in the end, the real valuable areas weren't even there. To help you break down what each of the different parties involved in this war wanted, you've got the list here. The British wanted the ability to expand westward so that their colonists had a place to move and expand to, right? They wanted room for the 13 colonies to expand into the west, which was taken up by the French at that point. So that was why they were focused on battling the French for that. The French in particular wanted to keep the access that they had, in particular with the trade with the indigenous groups, because they helped contribute to the fur trade. And just to maintain their colony, right? For that mercantilism, that idea that they could grow their wealth by buying and selling in that area. The Spanish were only there necessarily because they were allied with the French. Their main goal, though, was they wanted just to keep their access to those sugar islands for the sugar and for precious metals. So they weren't necessarily interested in the North American continent, continental areas, other than that their ally was there and they had to support them. And their support was mostly financial. And the indigenous group is the other part of this, and They wanted help from the European allies so that they could, continue their battles against competing bands and tribes. Also to expand territory that they had access to. But another significant goal, so there's two goals here for the Aboriginals. So ally with French or British to their own benefit, but also they recognized that British expansion goal and they wanted to protect against it. Okay. So here's your actual stages of conflict. This is your actual war, 7 years war. I realize after making this handout, I haven't even written it down on the page here. These are your stages of conflict, and it starts here, those 2 years prior to the actual war itself, right? And I have this bolded because this is the actual beginning of the war. So your actual numbers are 1756, okay? But you've got 2 years of aggression. And like we said, it's in that territory just west of those 13 colonies, right? In that Ohio River Valley. So it didn't go very well for the British to begin with. So fail number one is they sent that young George Washington, who eventually became president of the United States. He was sent in to take French forts in that territory where both British and French were settled. But the French and their French allies in particular were great militiamen. They were able to hold them back. So it was a humiliating defeat for the British. Fail number two was the British spent their money. They sent a number of troops overseas to overwhelm the small number of French that were protecting that territory. But the French colonist militia and Aboriginals were still able to use a different type of warfare, and we watched that in the video, over the British. Remember, for example, they were aware that the one British soldier or British general had a paranoia about Indigenous people. And so even though the First Nations groups and French were small in number, they jumped through the forest. They would shoot from here and they'd run over a few yards and shoot from there and run back. And they manipulated the impression of how large their size was, which freaked out those British soldiers. So they were able to capitalize on this paranoia. What? Yes, that's what we're talking about. The British soldiers were paranoid. The British leader was paranoid, and it was the French. No, it was the French and the First Nations that were able to, because they were way smaller in size. Like it says here, the French had 3,800 troops in one particular battle, and they were attacked by a group of 15,000. That because they were able to use their tactics to their own advantage, they were able to hold off that surge from the British soldiers. This is the difference in the money that was spent. In the war. The French chose not to send those troops or invest all that money, and the French settlers, colonists, their Aboriginal allies were able to use that still to their advantage for a period of time, although ultimately we know that they lost. Does that make sense now? We said that the British took Acadia, Nova Scotia, and this is a particular part of that, the back and forth. This Nova Scotia went back and forth for 100 years between ownership of British and French. So like we said, Acadia was a separate French colony, and in this particular battle, the British took Acadia in the Treaty of Utrecht, which is a treaty I might ask you about. This is the one where the French surrendered Acadia. It's another of the times when they surrendered Acadia. The Treaty of Utrecht, you can connect to this expulsion of the Acadians. So it is a part of Canadian history that's still looked back on quite negatively. Some people consider it a genocide because there were so many people that were It was like a forced assimilation, which we know happened back in the times of colonization. But it was one of the significant negative consequences of this war that those 6,000 people were relocated. And we said they either went back to two places. Where did they go? They went back to France, or they went to Louisiana. If you think about like New Orleans, the Cajun South, okay? And that's only if those French settlers in Acadia refused to align themselves, to pledge loyalty to the British and fight with the British, which a lot of them chose not to do. But what's also important here is this has another implication, or another consequence, I guess we could say. This is the British that removed existing settlers. And it was viewed very negatively. So this is one time. But another time that comes up is when they take, when the British take Quebec. And eventually, after the American Revolution happens and they kick all the loyalists out, they move north into what is Ontario and Quebec. And we know that Quebec has French language, French laws, French customs, because the British, instead of evicting those French people, decided to give them promises. So when the British take Quebec as the province, they have a different approach this time. If that Acadian expulsion hadn't happened, we might not have had a protected Quebec. And Canada would be a very different country, right? So this is one of those what ifs. Okay. Different approach this time, right? The Quebec Act comes as a result of the British recognizing that they wanted to satisfy or pacify the French that were in that French province. They didn't want to remove them or send them back to these different territories this time. So there's a difference here between how the British handled the French in Acadia and how the British handled the French in Quebec province. So that's an exam question. For sure. How much of this is review based on the research that you've already done yourself? Chloe, is this mostly review? Okay. That's only leading up to the war. Now, here I've underlined it, and that's your indication that this is where the 7 years, the beginning of that technical 7 years begins. And then things start going well for the British. So maybe that's why they count it as the declaration of war. They don't include the 2 years where they lost a lot. So 1757, the war starts going well for the British because they've made the decision to put a lot of money into it. They've made the commitment specifically because they want to grow that British Empire. It's mostly territory that they're after. And again, this is the comparison here. So comparison of the priorities of the two groups. It was a choice by the French not to financially support North American conflict. The French kept their financial support in Europe. They didn't send as many troops or supplies to North America, which was a part in them losing the war. The British did make that decision to significantly invest in that battle, in the resources. They sent a lot of troops. This is a significant part because it has a consequence. Or a significant consequence. They paid a lot of money to win that war, to win the territorial expansion, to gain all of that territory that we see on the map towards the end of the handout. But the cost of that was significant debt, and it had to get paid back by someone. And that someone were the colonists that were living there in the 13 colonies, and they resented that they had to pay all this tax, right? So Britain invested heavily in the war. They were able to eventually overpower the French colonists, who were few in number. And particularly because, if you remember, we said that they took Louisbourg. And so if they had access or control to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the Seaway, none of these French soldiers could get their supplies. Even the colonists themselves, if they weren't fighting, if the British were able to cut off their supplies, they could weaken them as a group significantly, right? Which is what they did. So it was a great financial cost, but in the end, it cost the British territory in the end, and they couldn't have foreseen that, really. So some of the key territories or locations that were captured from the French, there's a list of them here. This could be a great exam question as well, right? We talked about that Ohio River Valley. Both the French and the British believed that they had the rights to it. It was the territory in here, just west of the 13 colonies there. So the Ohio Valley was taken eventually by the British. The British were able to take Nova Scotia. Specifically, once they took that fortress of Louisbourg, they were able to block French supply ships. They took Fort Frontenac, which eventually becomes Kingston, Ontario, and there was a huge weapons stock there, so the British were able to significantly reduce French capabilities there. And I guess as Aboriginal groups started recognizing that the tides were turning in the balance of power there, the Aboriginal groups started making their own peace agreements with the British, which left the French with even fewer support. They took the territory of around the New York, greater New York area. And once Quebec City was taken, that was another significant blow. This Louisbourg was really significant. Quebec City, like we talked about, remember they said they climbed up the cliffs of Quebec City early in the morning with 10,000 troops or something. General Wolfe versus Montcalm. So that was the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. So that's the significant loss of Quebec City. Once Quebec was taken, they eventually captured Montreal, and then it was kind of game over, right? And if you're looking on the map, you'll see that, right? It's kind of tactical in its nature. They were able to take control of Louisbourg, so they controlled the access to the Seaway. They were able to take Quebec, which meant they really controlled inland resource supplies. They took Montreal, and they were able to block them up that much further. And by 1760, the fighting was done. The French ceded and gave up all of the territory they had previously claimed to in North America. The French had been removed from North America almost completely. And a big part of it was the naval dominance of the British and just the volume of resources. So if you want two reasons for British success, those are two. Better at their naval maneuvering and strategizing, and just the volume of what they invested in it. So 1763, after 3 years there, they signed the Treaty of Paris. And this establishes a new map. The new map of territory for North America. Okay. These are the lists of British gains that they took New France. They took this shouldn't say ally, take the E out of there. The Spanish ally to the French lost their Spanish Florida. They lost some of those sugar islands that were valued by the French in the Caribbean. And because of all the territory that they took over, the British now had ability to claim that they were a superior empire, imperial power with greater bragging rights. The French, in their negotiation of that peace agreement, were able to keep 2 of the islands in the Caribbean and 1 maritime island as a fishing station. And because they lost Spanish Florida from their ally, or of their allies, they gave their ally a large Louisiana territory to satisfy that ally so that they wouldn't lose them. So this part here, this Spanish Florida, was controlled by Spain. It was taken over by the British in this, or negotiated, and instead they gave this territory in here back to the Spanish. And it's important to point out that another part of the winning group here were the young future Americans here. They kept their 13 colonies. They now had greater territory that they could settle into, or so they thought. And this is important. And I just have a perspective box here. Like, you might think that the French really lost out in everything because of the amount of territory that they lost. But the French loss of Canada, or that land of New France, wasn't a significant hit to them as the British loss of those 13 colonies becomes. Because once they lose those 13 colonies, they lose the rest of that American territory eventually. So even though the British are the victors now, in the end, they become bigger losers in a way. So there's different ways of viewing it, right? There's 2 specific consequences from the 7 Years' War. So they're listed here. One of them is for the Aboriginal groups. Because there were 2 opposing European groups, they might have been able to negotiate and kind of play one off the other to get better deals for themselves. Now they only had one group to negotiate with, and that was the British. So they didn't get a lot in their peace deal. The Royal Proclamation establishes that new boundary line, and it created for them that reserve of the Indian settlement that was that disputed territory just west of those 13 colonies. So even though those colonists might have thought, okay, the British won that territory, now we can expand, the British guaranteed and promised that territory to the First Nations groups in order for them to pacify and no longer fight them. That angered the colonists here. Was a major catalyst in the conflicts to come. Another consequence here was that eventually what happened, it was called race consciousness. Even though all these First Nations groups were different in their needs and diverse in their history, they eventually started recognizing a kind of shared need between them. Despite their enemy or alliances here, they started to recognize that they had similarities in protecting themselves against the white settler expansion there. And the second big part of this was the taxation. So along with this Aboriginal part, you could put here the land set aside or the land reserved. That kind of clarifies it with the Aboriginal connection there. But the second part here is the taxation then. Britain had won this war, but at a significant financial cost, and now who had to pay for it? They taxed the American colonists, but the colonists now didn't need protection from anybody, so they didn't want to continue paying for protection. And because there were no other enemies in North America, the French had been pushed back. It really emboldened these settlers for their own rebellion or revolution, and then that is what leads to the American Revolution. Now you've got 10 minutes before the bell goes, and I've got an activity for you. I'd like you to use a hierarchy of needs here. Starting at the bottom, these are the priorities. Whatever's at the bottom is most important. And what is at the top is least important. No, hierarchy of needs is that you have to satisfy the base needs first before you can focus on the additional needs. So, most important priorities at the bottom, least important, but also important. At the top, I'd like you to do one for the British, and I'd like you to do one for the French, and figure out what were their priorities. And you can kind of tell based on what their actions were, what their investments were, where they kept the majority of their resources. I've mentioned it a few times, but I'd like you to review it and see if you can figure that out. The point here is that they had different priorities. They had different priorities, which partially resulted in the outcomes for each. So take a few minutes and see if you can figure that out.